before Sumer, before Egypt, before recorded time itself. A civilization so advanced it reset history, leaving impossible ruins, forbidden knowledge, and global myths as warnings. Every timeline points to one origin, then suddenly goes silent. The name that entered science first. In the middle decades of the 19th century, naturalists tried to explain why the same kinds of animals appeared on landmasses that were separated by wide oceans. The maps were already reliable enough to show distance clearly, and shipping records made the separation feel practical, not abstract. A person could sail for weeks and still not find a bridge of land, yet some plants and animals seemed to suggest older connections. In 1864, an English zoologist named Philip Lutley Sclater published a short paper in the Quarterly Journal of Science while working in London. He focused on lemurs and related primates, noting their strong presence in Madagascar and nearby regions, and their absence from much of Africa. The distribution looked uneven in a way that was hard to explain using the mechanisms available at the time. In that paper, he proposed a former land connection across parts of the Indian Ocean. He used the word Lemuria for the lost land, naming it after the animals that seemed to point toward it. His language was careful and tied to geography and taxonomy rather than myth. He treated it as a practical placeholder for a connection that might have existed before the present arrangement of continents. The idea fit comfortably into the 19th century habit of drawing maps of the past. Geologists in Britain, France, and Germany were already discussing uplift, subsidence, and long-term changes in sea level. Charles Lyell's work had helped normalize slow change over long periods, even when the details remained unclear. In that context, a sunken landmass was not an exotic claim. It was one way to make sense of living patterns using the logic of the day. Other researchers picked up the term quickly, sometimes with different goals. Ernst Haeckel, working in Germany, used Lemuria in the 1870s in discussions about human origins and early migration. In his writing, the landmass became more than a bridge for lemurs. It became a stage for hypothetical early forms of humans, tied to his broader views on evolution. Haeckel's language sometimes treated a lost southern land as a reasonable setting for transitions that were then poorly documented in the fossil record. The word moved from animal distribution into anthropology, even though the evidence remained indirect. By the late 19th century, the name also drifted into religious and esoteric writing. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky included Lemuria in The Secret Doctrine in 1888, written while she was associated with theosophical circles that operated in India and Europe. In that setting, the term no longer served as a limited scientific proposal. It became part of a larger spiritual history with successive root races, a structure that was presented as ancient knowledge rather than a testable model. The book treated Lemuria as an earlier world era and used a confident tone that did not match the cautious style of natural history journals. This shift in usage created two separate tracks for the same word. One track stayed within older scientific debates about geography. The other track treated the name as a fixed historical reality. During the same period, the physical sciences were changing. Oceanography began to develop as an organized field, helped by expeditions that gathered depth measurements and seabed samples. The Challenger expedition of 1872 to 1876, led by British naval and scientific staff, produced large collections of data about the deep sea. Soundings showed that the Indian Ocean floor was not a shallow, drowned shelf in most places. It contained deep basins and long ridges. Those features did not make a single sunken continent impossible, but they made simple sketches less convincing. By the early 20th century, new lines of evidence began to replace the older need for lost land bridges. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912, drawing attention to the fit of coastlines and the matching of fossils and rock layers across oceans. His ideas were resisted for decades, especially in Britain and the United States, partly because he lacked a widely accepted mechanism. Even so, the broader direction of thought was changing. Instead of imagining continents that sank intact, researchers increasingly considered that continents might move. After the Second World War, seafloor mapping advanced quickly. Naval research, sonar surveys, and improved sampling methods produced clearer pictures of mid-ocean ridges, trenches, and spreading centers. In the 1960s, plate tectonics brought these observations into a coherent framework. Continental drift became part of a larger system driven by seafloor spreading and subduction. In that system, the earlier Lemuria of Sclater's paper was no longer needed to explain animal distribution, long separation, island stepping stones, and changing climates could be considered without requiring a vanished continent across the Indian Ocean. Some parts of Sclater's original problem did not disappear. Madagascar remains a complex biogeographic case, with lineages that raise careful questions about timing and pathways. Modern studies treat the island's history through a mix of fossil evidence, genetic clocks, and plate reconstructions. Researchers discuss Gondwana, the breakup of ancient supercontinents, and the movement of India northward. These are grounded in measurable geology, rather than an assumed land bridge. The name Lemuria still appears in scientific writing, but often as a historical reference rather than a current model. In older library catalogues, the term is attached to debates that shaped early biogeography. In the margins of those debates, there are specific places and dates that show how researchers worked. Sclater wrote from London in an era when specimens arrived from colonial networks and museum collections. Haeckel wrote from Jena with a broader agenda about evolution and human development. These contexts explain why the same word could be used for different purposes. In recent decades, one geological finding has given the name an additional, limited afterlife in a new form. In 2013, a team led by Louis Ashwell and colleagues reported evidence of ancient continental material associated with Mauritius, east of Madagascar, based on zircons found in beach sands. Zircons can be dated and can preserve ages far older than the volcanic rocks of many oceanic islands. The researchers suggested that fragments of continental crust could exist beneath young volcanic cover in the region. The work did not revive Sclater's Lemuria as a full continent, and it did not claim a single sunken landmass spanning the Indian Ocean. It described pieces of older crust that might be remnants from the breakup of Gondwana. Even so, media coverage sometimes used familiar language, and Lemuria resurfaced as a headline term. A careful reading of the history shows a word moving through different institutions and expectations. It began as a practical label in zoology, published in a short scientific argument. It expanded into broader evolutionary writing, then into spiritual systems that treated it as settled history. Later, it remained in public memory long after geology had replaced the need for it. The name itself persisted because it was easy to repeat and easy to picture, even when the underlying scientific reasons for using it had changed, mapping the word across the Indian Ocean. By the late 19th century, the word Lemuria no longer belonged to a single article or author. It appeared instead across a scattered paper trail, made up of maps, marginal notes, travel accounts, and institutional publications. These materials did not agree on details, but they shared a habit of treating the name as if it described a location that could be sketched, labelled, and discussed. Early appearances of Lemuria on maps were often informal. They showed up in lecture slides, society presentations, and speculative diagrams rather than in official atlases. Some were printed in small academic journals with limited circulation. Others were drawn by hand and reproduced in monochrome plates. The landmass was usually placed in the Indian Ocean, stretching unevenly between Madagascar, India, and sometimes Australia. Coastlines were vague. Boundaries were rarely defined. The purpose was illustrative rather than precise. Publishing centres played a key role in this spread. London, Paris, Berlin, and Calcutta served as hubs where scientific papers, translations, and commentaries were exchanged. A zoological note printed in Britain might be summarized in a French review journal within months. German natural philosophy texts were translated into English and reissued with editorial additions. In this environment, Lemuria moved faster as a word than as a tested idea. Museums also contributed to this circulation. In the second half of the 19th century, institutions such as the British Museum, the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, and the Berlin Museum of Natural History expanded their collections rapidly. Specimens from Madagascar, India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia were catalogued side by side. Curators sometimes added speculative geographic notes to explain similarities between distant species. These notes were not always published formally, but they influenced how visiting scholars and students thought about distribution. Travel literature added another layer. European explorers and colonial officials wrote detailed accounts of journeys across the Indian Ocean world. These books described coastlines, ports, currents, and island chains with practical attention to navigation and trade. Occasionally, authors referenced Lemuria indirectly, noting that some scientists believed the sea itself concealed an older geography. Such remarks were usually brief and cautious, but they helped situate the idea in a physical setting familiar to readers. In India, the term gained additional visibility through theosophical publications and lectures. Printing presses in Madras and Bombay produced pamphlets that combined spiritual instruction with references to ancient lands and cycles of civilization. Lemuria was presented not as a hypothesis but as a remembered stage of world history. These texts often cited Western scientific names to lend authority, even when the content departed sharply from academic norms. Because these works circulated widely within theosophical networks, the word reached audiences far beyond zoology or geology. Cartographic habits of the era made this blending easier. Many 19th century maps included speculative elements, especially when depicting deep oceans or poorly surveyed regions. Blank areas invited annotation. Labels such as unknown depths or hypothetical land were not unusual. In this context, adding a name like Lemuria did not immediately signal fiction. It sat alongside other provisional markings that reflected the limits of current knowledge. Academic responses varied by discipline. Some geologists treated Lemuria as unnecessary and avoided the term entirely, preferring to discuss uplift and subsidence in general terms. Others used it cautiously, with quotation marks or disclaimers. Zoologists and botanists were more willing to reference it when discussing distribution patterns, even if they did not commit to its existence as a single landmass. Anthropologists and comparative anatomists sometimes used it as a convenient backdrop for early human history, especially before fossil evidence became more robust. Language barriers also shaped how the idea traveled. Translations were not always exact. A German discussion of a former southern land connection might be rendered in English as a reference to Lemuria, even if the original author used a more general phrase. Over time, these translation choices reinforced the name itself, making it seem more established than it was. By the early 20th century, the map-like treatment of Lemuria began to fade in academic contexts. Improved bathymetric data showed the depth and complexity of the Indian Ocean floor. Soundings revealed long ridges such as the 90 East Ridge and deep basins that did not align with simple continental outlines. These findings made it harder to draw convincing maps of a sunken continent without ignoring large amounts of data. Despite this, popular illustrations continued to appear. Encyclopedias aimed at general audiences sometimes included small inset maps showing lost continents alongside Atlantis and other legendary places. These images were often recycled across editions and publishers, even as scientific opinion moved on. The persistence of such images reflected editorial conservatism rather than active endorsement. Educational materials show a similar pattern. School textbooks rarely mentioned Lemuria directly, but supplementary readers and lecture handouts sometimes did. In these settings, the term functioned as a historical curiosity or as an example of how scientific ideas change. It was presented alongside earlier theories that had been replaced, without extended analysis. The Indian Ocean itself remained central to these discussions. Its vastness and relative opacity compared to land made it a natural canvas for speculation. Unlike the Atlantic, which had been intensively studied due to transatlantic travel and trade, the Indian Ocean's deep interior was slower to yield detailed data. This delay allowed older concepts to linger longer in the public imagination. Archival records from scientific societies show that Lemuria was discussed less frequently after about 1920. When it did appear, it was often in historical reviews or debates about methodology. Authors used it to illustrate the dangers of relying too heavily on distribution patterns without geological support. In these texts, the name functioned as a caution rather than a proposal. The act of mapping, even when informal, gave Lemuria a sense of place that outlasted its scientific utility. Once a name is printed on a map, it acquires a certain durability. Readers remember shapes and labels more easily than arguments. This visual persistence helps explain why Lemuria remained recognizable long after its original context had narrowed, from land bridge to lost age. As the 19th century gave way to the early 20th, the word Lemuria underwent a quiet change. It no longer appeared primarily as a solution to a geographic problem. Instead, it began to function as a marker of time. The land bridge, proposed by zoologists, slowly receded, while the idea of an earlier age moved forward. This shift did not happen through a single publication or decision. It occurred through repetition across different kinds of writing. Scientific literature narrowed its use of the term. Journals focused instead on measurable processes such as sedimentation, crustal movement, and fossil correlation. When Lemuria was mentioned, it was often framed as an example from an earlier phase of the discipline. Authors cited it to show how explanations had changed, not to argue for its return. At the same time, the word gained stability outside academic settings. Popular histories, spiritual texts, and comparative myth studies continued to reference Lemuria as if its basic outline were already settled. These works did not emphasize location or geology, they focused instead on sequence. Lemuria was placed before known civilizations, often before recorded history itself. Its position in time became more important than its placement on a map. This transformation can be traced in print. In the late 19th century, Lemuria usually appeared alongside terms like subsidence, uplift, or faunal distribution. By the early 20th century, it appeared next to words such as epoch, race, or cycle. The surrounding language changed even when the name stayed the same. Readers encountered it less as a scientific tool and more as a label for an early stage of the world. Theosophical writings played a significant role in fixing this temporal meaning. Helena Blavatsky's work had already placed Lemuria within a sequence of vast human ages. Later writers in the same tradition expanded on this structure. Publications issued in Adyar, London, and New York describe Lemuria as preceding Atlantis and later civilizations. These texts often included dates measured in hundreds of thousands or millions of years. The numbers were presented calmly, without argument, as inherited knowledge rather than estimates. In these accounts, Lemuria was no longer fragile. It did not sink gradually due to geological forces. It ended as part of a transition between ages. The emphasis rested on continuity rather than catastrophe. Readers were invited to imagine long spans of time populated by societies that left few physical traces. The absence of evidence was treated as expected rather than problematic. Outside spiritual movements, similar patterns appeared in speculative anthropology and early comparative mythology. Some authors writing between 1910 and 1930 treated Lemuria as a hypothetical cradle for symbolic systems shared across Asia and the Pacific. They pointed to similarities in myths, architectural forms, or ritual practices. These connections were described cautiously in some cases, but the underlying assumption remained that a very old, shared past could explain them. Museums and universities rarely endorsed such ideas formally. However, public lectures and evening talks sometimes addressed them as curiosities. Notices in newspapers from cities like London, Sydney, and San Francisco show announcements for talks on lost continents or forgotten ages. Lemuria appeared alongside Atlantis and Mu. These events were often presented as educational entertainment rather than research updates. The tone was informative but unchallenging. The language of time suited Lemuria well. Unlike geography, time could stretch without visible contradiction. Maps invited scrutiny. Ages did not. By placing Lemuria far enough back, writers avoided direct comparison with known archaeological layers. The idea became insulated by distance. It existed in a span where documentation was assumed to be thin. During this period, archaeology itself was changing. Excavations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley began to produce clearer chronologies for early urban societies. Writing systems could be dated, layers could be measured. These findings pushed the known history of civilization further back, but not infinitely. As timelines became more precise, claims about extremely ancient advanced cultures became harder to integrate with material evidence. Rather than disappearing, Lemuria adapted. It moved into a category where it did not compete directly with excavated sites. It was framed as earlier than agriculture, earlier than writing, earlier than durable architecture. In this framing, the lack of stone ruins or inscriptions was not a weakness. It was part of the description. The age was said to precede the need for such markers. Popular encyclopedias from the early 20th century reflect this transition. Entries on Lemuria often began with a brief note about its origin as a scientific hypothesis. They then shifted quickly to broader cultural interpretations. The tone was neutral, but the structure placed the Lost Age interpretation last, leaving it as the lingering impression. Readers encountered Lemuria as both outdated science and enduring idea. The word also appeared in fiction during this period, though usually in restrained ways. Short stories and novels reference Lemuria as a background element rather than a setting for action. It was mentioned in passing as part of a world with deep layers of forgotten time. These references reinforced the association between the name and extreme antiquity without demanding belief. By the mid-20th century, Lemuria's identity as a land bridge had largely faded from public memory. Few readers remembered Sclater's original paper or its specific concerns about lemur distribution. What remained was the sense of an origin civilization that existed before familiar history. The word functioned as shorthand for a deep past that was assumed to be complex but inaccessible. This change did not require agreement. Different writers placed Lemuria at different points in time. Some aligned it with early human development. Others treated it as pre-human. The lack of consensus did not weaken the term's presence. Instead, it allowed flexibility. Lemuria could adapt to the needs of different narratives without losing its basic role as a marker of beginnings. In academic settings, Lemuria survived mainly as a historical reference. Courses on the history of geology and biogeography mentioned it briefly to illustrate how explanations evolve. In these contexts, it was presented without judgment, as a product of its time. Students learned the name as part of a sequence of ideas rather than as a description of reality. The transition from place to age was gradual and largely unremarked. There was no clear moment when Lemuria stopped being a map feature and became a temporal symbol. The shift occurred through accumulation, as repeated uses emphasized one aspect over another. Over time, the weight of meaning moved away from geography and settled into deep history. Dates without layers. When Lemuria became associated with a distant age rather than a physical landmass, a new problem appeared quietly in the background. Time now had to be assigned without material layers. There were no ruins to excavate, no inscriptions to translate, and no stratified sites to measure. They entered print calmly, often without explanation, and remained largely uncontested within the circles that used them. In scientific fields, time was increasingly tied to physical evidence. By the early 20th century, geology relied on stratigraphy, fossil succession, and later radiometric methods to establish relative and absolute ages. Archaeology used layered deposits to build chronologies. In these systems, dates were anchored to things that could be observed, sampled, and compared. Lemuria did not fit easily into this framework. As a result, academic writing rarely attempted to date it precisely. Outside those fields, different conventions applied. Writers who treated Lemuria as a lost age often borrowed the language of science without adopting its methods. Large numbers appeared, usually expressed in rounded figures. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of years were used interchangeably, depending on context. These numbers were not argued for. They were presented as background information, similar to the way a map might show a mountain range without explaining how it formed. Some of the earliest extended timelines came from theosophical texts, published between the 1880s and the 1920s. These works divided human and pre-human history into vast cycles. Lemuria was placed early in these sequences, often following even earlier, unnamed epochs. Dates were sometimes given in millions of years, aligning loosely with emerging geological estimates for the age of the Earth. The numbers conveyed depth rather than precision. Their function was to establish distance from the present, not to synchronize with known archaeological horizons. The absence of layers was not treated as a gap. Instead, it was reframed as a feature of the age itself. Lemuria was described as existing before durable building materials were used, or before societies relied on stone monuments. In this framing, there was no expectation of remains. The lack of physical traces became consistent with the assigned time period, rather than a contradiction of it. Comparative myth studies contributed additional temporal markers. Some scholars and popular writers in the early 20th century attempted to align myths from South Asia, Polynesia, and parts of Southeast Asia into broad sequences. They noted recurring themes of earlier worlds, submerged lands, or previous ages of humanity. These narratives were not dated in the modern sense, but they were ordered. Lemuria was sometimes placed at the beginning of these sequences, ahead of better-known legendary periods. Calendrical systems also played a role. Hindu cosmology, with its yugas and long cycles, provided a vocabulary for extended time. Some writers mapped Lemuria onto these cycles, suggesting that it belonged to an early yuga or transitional phase. This mapping did not rely on archaeological correlation. It relied on perceived thematic similarities between ancient texts and modern reconstructions. Dates emerged indirectly through this alignment, translated into years for contemporary readers. Scientific caution persisted in parallel. Geologists and archaeologists who encountered such dates in popular writing rarely engaged with them directly. There was little incentive to refute numbers that were not tied to testable claims. As a result, the dates circulated without formal challenge. Silence functioned as separation rather than endorsement. In encyclopedias and reference works aimed at general audiences, dates were sometimes presented with qualifying language. Phrases such as "said to have existed" or "sometimes placed" appeared before figures. These constructions allowed the information to be included without full commitment. Readers encountered numbers, but also subtle signals that these numbers belonged to a different category of knowledge. By the mid-20th century, radiometric dating reshaped discussions of deep time in science. Techniques using uranium, potassium, and carbon isotopes provided more reliable age estimates for rocks and organic material. These methods produced dates that could be checked and revised. In contrast, Lemurian dates remained static. A figure published in one decade often reappeared unchanged decades later. This stability came from repetition rather than verification. The difference between layered time and unlayered time became more pronounced. Layered time accumulated detail as methods improved. Unlayered time remained broad and smooth. Lemuria belonged to the latter. Its age was less a measurement than a position. It marked an early zone beyond the reach of tools that defined historical study. Occasionally, attempts were made to connect Lemuria to physical evidence. Geological features such as submerged plateaus or ridges in the Indian Ocean were cited as possible remnants. When ages were assigned to these features, the numbers were sometimes extended outward to cover Lemuria as a whole. This process moved from specific measurements to generalized timelines. The original context of the data often faded in retelling. The discovery of ancient zircons beneath volcanic islands added a new layer of complexity. Zircons dated to billions of years indicated that fragments of continental crust could exist where none were expected. These findings were specific and technical, tied to precise sampling locations. When referenced in broader discussions, the dates sometimes expanded again, becoming part of a larger story about lost lands. The original caution of the researchers was not always carried forward. Educational materials reflected this divide. University courses emphasized layered time, training students to associate dates with samples and contexts. Popular books and lectures continued to use expansive dates for Lemuria without such anchors. The two systems coexisted without direct conflict because they addressed different audiences and purposes. The persistence of dates without layers did not depend on agreement. Writers placed Lemuria at different points along the deep time spectrum. Some located it just before known prehistoric cultures. Others placed it far earlier, before recognizable human forms. The variation did not disrupt the narrative function of the dates. All of them served to separate Lemuria from recorded history. In this way, time itself became the primary structure supporting the idea. Geography had once given Lemuria shape. When that shape dissolved, chronology took its place. Even without layers, dates provided order. They allowed Lemuria to remain positioned at the beginning of a long sequence, distant enough to resist direct comparison, echoes in language and symbol. As physical evidence and stratified dates remained absent, another form of support emerged quietly around Lemuria. It took the shape of words, symbols, and recurring motifs. These elements did not depend on excavation or measurement. They were drawn instead from comparative reading, translation, and pattern recognition across cultures that bordered the Indian and Pacific Oceans. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, comparative linguistics was an expanding field. Scholars collected vocabularies from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Polynesia, and parts of Africa, arranging them side by side in tables. The goal was to trace relationships between language families and to reconstruct earlier forms. In this work, similarities were expected, but their interpretation varied. Some linguists explained them through migration and contact. Others suggested deeper, older connections that predated known movements. Within this environment, Lemuria appeared as a possible background condition. It was not always named directly. Sometimes it functioned as an implied stage on which early language groups could have interacted before dispersal. Certain syllables, sounds, or root forms were noted as appearing across wide distances. These observations were usually tentative. Still, when repeated across publications, they contributed to a sense of inherited structure rather than coincidence. Symbolic studies followed a similar path. Researchers and writers compared motifs found in myths, carvings, and ritual objects across regions. Serpents, cosmic mountains, floods, and layered worlds appeared frequently in these comparisons. Such symbols were not unique to any one culture, and most scholars acknowledged this. Yet, some authors arranged them into sequences that suggested inheritance from a common source rather than independent development. Lemuria entered these discussions as a neutral container. It offered a way to place shared symbols in a time before documented cultural exchange. By positioning the source far enough back, writers avoided the need to demonstrate direct contact. The explanation relied on depth rather than proximity. Symbols were said to survive as echoes, carried forward through memory rather than through continuous tradition. Names also played a role. Place names, deity names, and legendary figures were compared across languages. For example, names associated with Earth, mother figures, or foundational beings were grouped together across cultures. These groupings were not systematic in a modern linguistic sense. They were associative, drawing strength from repetition rather than strict methodology. Translation choices reinforced these associations. Early translators often worked with limited reference material. A single word in an ancient text might be rendered differently depending on context or preference. Over time, certain translations became standard through reuse. When these translations included terms that suggested antiquity or origin, they were sometimes linked back to Lemuria in later commentary. In South Asian texts, references to earlier worlds or cycles were read alongside Polynesian oral traditions describing submerged lands. The similarities were not exact. They did not need to be. The focus was on structure rather than detail. Both sets of traditions spoke of prior states of the world, transitions, and losses. Lemuria was positioned as a shared background that made these parallel structures appear related. Art history contributed additional material. Decorative patterns found on pottery, textiles, and ritual objects were compared across regions. Spirals, concentric circles, and repeating geometric forms were noted in cultures separated by oceans. Some researchers treated these patterns as universal design solutions. Others suggested transmission from a very early source. In the latter view, Lemuria functioned as an origin point that did not require preservation of specific techniques, only broad aesthetic memory. These symbolic echoes were often presented without emphasis. They appeared in footnotes, side discussions, or appended chapters. The tone remained calm and descriptive. Authors rarely insisted on a single interpretation. Instead, they allowed the accumulation of examples to suggest continuity. The reader was left with a sense of connection rather than a stated conclusion. Academic reception remained cautious. Linguists increasingly refined their methods, focusing on sound laws and documented transitions. Symbolic comparisons without strict controls lost favor within universities. However, the older comparative style persisted in popular works and interdisciplinary writing. These texts occupied a space between scholarship and speculation, where Lemuria could continue to serve as a reference point. The persistence of symbolic explanation did not depend on precision. Symbols do not erode or subduct like landmasses. They change slowly, if at all, within narrative traditions. This made them suitable carriers for very old associations. Lemuria, as an early age, fit naturally into this symbolic register. It required no surviving architecture, only continuity of meaning. In some cases, the direction of influence reversed. Rather than using symbols to support Lemuria, writers used Lemuria to organize symbols. Myths were arranged into chronological layers, with Lemurian material placed at the bottom. Later stories were said to build upon these foundations. This ordering gave coherence to otherwise unrelated traditions. By the mid-20th century, structural anthropology and comparative mythology began to formalize symbolic analysis. Figures such as Claude Lévi-Strauss emphasized universal patterns of human thought rather than historical transmission. This shift reduced the need for lost civilizations as explanatory tools. Even so, earlier works continued to circulate, and their influence persisted outside academic theory. Language and symbol allowed Lemuria to remain active without physical confirmation. They operated in a domain where verification was interpretive rather than empirical. The connections were not proven, but they were not easily dismissed either. They occupied a middle ground shaped by reading, translation, and comparison. In this way, Lemuria became less about what could be shown and more about what could be recognized. Familiar shapes, repeated sounds, and shared narrative forms created a sense of continuity that did not rely on location or date. The idea endured not because it was demonstrated, but because it aligned with how people organized meaning across time. The quiet absence of ruins. For most ancient civilizations, physical remains form the starting point of study. Walls, tools, burials, and inscriptions create fixed points that anchor interpretation. Lemuria developed along a different path. Its defining feature became the absence of such remains. This absence was not treated as a temporary gap to be filled. It was incorporated into the description itself. Early discussions acknowledged this lack directly. Writers in the late 19th century noted that no ruins, cities, or monuments had been identified that could be linked to Lemuria. In scientific contexts, this acknowledgement functioned as a limitation. It signaled that the idea rested on indirect evidence and provisional reasoning. Outside those contexts, the same absence was reframed as expected. The explanation often began with time. Lemuria was placed far earlier than known architectural traditions. Stone construction, in this framing, belonged to later stages of human development. Earlier societies were described as relying on perishable materials such as wood, fiber, and earth. Over long spans, these materials would leave little trace, especially in tropical or coastal environments. Geography reinforced this reasoning. Lemuria was usually located in regions now covered by ocean. Submergence provided a simple mechanism for loss. If settlements had existed on low-lying land, they would have been submerged as sea levels changed. Once underwater, erosion, sedimentation, and biological activity would further reduce visible remains. The sea explained silence without requiring further detail. Oceanography supported this explanation indirectly. Studies of submerged landscapes showed how coastlines could shift over relatively short geological periods. Continental shelves revealed drowned river valleys and former shorelines. These findings demonstrated that land loss was a real process, even if they did not point to Lemuria specifically. The general principle was enough to sustain the idea. In popular writing, the absence of ruins was sometimes presented as a contrast rather than a problem. Later civilizations were said to have left stone and metal because they existed in harsher or more competitive environments. Lemuria, by contrast, was described as existing in a stable climate that did not demand durable construction. This contrast positioned material simplicity as a choice rather than a limitation. The lack of inscriptions posed a similar issue. Writing systems leave durable marks, and their absence usually limits historical reconstruction. Lemurian narratives address this by placing writing later in human development. Language, in this view, existed primarily in spoken form. Knowledge was transmitted orally or symbolically rather than through permanent records. This explanation aligned with broader theories about the evolution of writing. Archaeology did not provide direct support for these claims, but it did offer parallels. Paleolithic sites often preserve only scattered tools or hearths. Organic materials rarely survive. These examples showed that long periods of human activity could leave minimal traces. Lemurian writers extended this logic across much greater spans of time and geography. Attempts to locate ruins occasionally surfaced. Reports of submerged structures, stone alignments, or anomalous formations in the Indian and Pacific Oceans were cited intermittently. These reports were usually second-hand and poorly documented. When investigated more closely, many were explained as natural formations or recent constructions. Even so, they circulated in summaries and compilations, reinforcing the expectation that ruins might exist but had not yet been confirmed. The pattern of investigation mattered. Most oceanic exploration was conducted for navigation, resource extraction, or military purposes. Archaeological surveying of deep-sea environments remained limited for much of the 20th century. The absence of ruins could therefore be attributed to lack of access rather than non-existence. This argument did not require proof. It relied on the known difficulty of the environment. Museums and academic institutions generally avoided collecting or displaying materials linked to Lemuria. Without artifacts, there was nothing to catalogue. This institutional silence had an unintended effect. By not engaging, universities and museums left the topic to alternative venues. The absence of authoritative rejection allowed older explanations to persist without revision. In some texts, the lack of ruins was elevated to a defining quality. Lemuria was described as a civilization that did not rely on permanent structures. Its legacy was said to reside in patterns of thought, social organization, or symbolic systems, rather than in stone. This description aligned with earlier chapters' emphasis on language and symbol. Material absence and symbolic presence reinforced each other. Comparisons with Atlantis highlighted this difference. Atlantis was often described with cities, walls, and technology. Lemuria was quieter. It was older, less defined, and less architectural. This contrast allowed Lemuria to occupy a different conceptual space. It did not compete with archaeological narratives centered on monuments. It existed alongside them as a deeper, less tangible layer. Scientific developments gradually narrowed the room for such explanations. Advances in remote sensing, submersible technology, and underwater archaeology expanded the range of detectable structures. Shipwrecks, ancient harbors, and submerged settlements were documented in coastal areas around the world. These successes demonstrated that underwater ruins could be found and studied. At the same time, they highlighted the continued absence of anything that could be clearly associated with Lemuria. Rather than dissolving the idea, this contrast refined it. Lemuria became associated not with missing ruins waiting to be discovered, but with a mode of existence that did not produce ruins at all. The expectation of discovery diminished. The narrative shifted toward permanence of influence rather than permanence of objects. Educational treatments reflected this shift. When Lemuria was mentioned, it was often framed as an example of a concept defined by indirect traces. Students were taught to distinguish between material cultures supported by excavation and conceptual cultures inferred from patterns. Lemuria occupied the latter category. Its absence became a teaching point rather than a flaw. The quiet absence of ruins also affected tone. Without artifacts to display or describe, writing about Lemuria remained abstract and subdued. There were no measurements to list, no architectural features to reconstruct. The language stayed general. This restraint contributed to the calm, observational style that characterized much of the literature. Over time, the absence itself gained a form of stability. New discoveries elsewhere did not alter it. Each year that passed without Lemurian ruins reinforced the existing explanations. Silence accumulated as a kind of evidence, not in a scientific sense, but in a narrative one. In this way, Lemuria persisted without excavation. It relied on frameworks that did not require physical confirmation. Its defining characteristics were depth, distance, and quietness. The lack of ruins did not weaken the idea within its own logic. It completed it. Lemuria in scientific retreat. By the early 20th century, Lemuria no longer occupied the center of scientific discussion. Its retreat did not occur through a decisive rejection or a single refuting paper. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through omission. The term appeared less often in journals, conference proceedings, and teaching materials. When it did appear, it was framed as part of an earlier stage of inquiry rather than a current problem to be solved. Scientific journals illustrate this shift clearly. In the late 19th century, articles on biogeography sometimes referenced Lemuria when discussing animal distribution across the Indian Ocean. By the 1910s, such references had largely disappeared. Authors chose different language. They discussed island chains, migration routes, and geological history without invoking a vanished continent. The problems remained, but the vocabulary changed. Conference records show a similar pattern. Meetings of geological and zoological societies increasingly focused on measurable processes. Presentations addressed sediment layers, fossil assemblages, and structural geology. When historical concepts were mentioned, they were usually placed in introductory remarks or retrospectives. Lemuria appeared in these contexts as an example of how earlier scientists attempted to work with limited data. Textbooks provide another record of retreat. Late 19th century texts occasionally included short discussions of lost land bridges as plausible explanations. Early 20th century editions revised or removed these sections. New chapters emphasized continental stability, isostasy, and later, continental movement. Lemuria was sometimes mentioned in footnotes or end-of-chapter notes, identified as a hypothesis that had been proposed and then set aside. This process was not confrontational. Scientific communities rarely revisit discarded ideas unless they obstruct current work. Lemuria did not. Once alternative explanations became available, the term simply became unnecessary. Its withdrawal was pragmatic rather than polemical. The rise of continental drift played a key role in this change. Although Alfred Wegener's proposal initially faced resistance, it encouraged scientists to think about large-scale movement rather than disappearance. As evidence accumulated through the mid-20th century, the idea of continents sinking intact became increasingly difficult to support. Lemuria, as originally conceived, belonged to an earlier conceptual framework. Plate tectonics later provided a comprehensive explanation for many of the patterns Lemuria had been used to address. The separation of land masses, the distribution of species, and the formation of ocean basins could all be discussed within a unified model. In this framework, land bridges were temporary and local rather than continental and permanent. The Indian Ocean no longer required a missing continent to explain its biological history. Institutional practices reinforced this shift. Research funding, publication priorities, and graduate training favored topics grounded in observable data. Students were taught to frame questions around testable hypotheses. Lemuria, lacking direct evidence and clear methodology, did not fit these expectations. It became an example used in courses on the history of science rather than in active research programs. Library cataloging reflects this reclassification. Works on Lemuria, published after about 1930, were increasingly shelved under philosophy, religion, or speculative history rather than natural science. Earlier scientific works remained in circulation, but they were often cited for historical interest. The physical placement of books mirrored the conceptual repositioning of the idea. Scientific caution also played a role. Researchers became more aware of how easily provisional explanations could harden into assumed facts. Lemuria served as a reminder of this risk. By treating it as a resolved historical episode, scientists reinforced norms of evidence and restraint. The name was not attacked. It was simply set aside. Despite this retreat, Lemuria did not vanish entirely from scientific language. It continued to appear in review articles that traced the development of biogeographic thought. Authors discussed how early naturalists reasoned from limited information and how their conclusions reflected the tools available at the time. In these narratives, Lemuria functioned as a teaching example rather than a claim. Occasionally, the term resurfaced briefly when new data seemed to echo older questions. Discoveries of submerged continental fragments or anomalous geological features prompted journalists to revive familiar names. Scientific papers themselves were careful. They described findings in precise terms, often avoiding historical labels. When Lemuria was mentioned, it appeared in quotation marks or in sections discussing public interpretation. This selective use highlights an important feature of scientific retreat. Ideas do not always disappear because they are disproven. They disappear because they no longer help. Lemuria had once provided a convenient way to talk about connections across oceans. When better tools emerged, the convenience faded. The retreat was also uneven across disciplines. Geology moved away from Lemuria earlier and more decisively than anthropology or comparative studies. Fields that relied less on physical evidence retained the term longer, often in metaphorical or illustrative ways. Scientific retreat, in this sense, was not uniform. It followed the contours of methodology. By the mid-20th century, most practicing scientists encountered Lemuria only indirectly. It appeared in historical overviews, older citations, or interdisciplinary discussions. New generations learned about it as part of the background of their field, not as an open question. It became descriptive of past thinking rather than a proposal about the world. The absence of formal rejection sometimes created ambiguity outside scientific circles. Because Lemuria was not publicly refuted in dramatic terms, it remained available for reuse. Readers encountering the term in non-scientific contexts might not realize that it had been quietly abandoned within science. The retreat, being subtle, left room for misunderstanding. Scientific writing style contributed to this effect. Neutral language and avoidance of definitive statements are standard practice. When Lemuria was described as an early hypothesis or historical concept, these phrases carried clear meaning within the field. Outside it, they could be read as cautious endorsement rather than closure. Over time, the gap between scientific usage and public usage widened. Within science, Lemuria belonged to history. Outside it, the term continued to circulate as an active idea. This divergence did not prompt immediate correction because it did not interfere with research. The two conversations proceeded independently. The retreat of Lemuria illustrates how scientific knowledge is managed through attention rather than confrontation. Concepts are retained when they organize data effectively and released when they do not. The process leaves traces in archives, textbooks, and institutional memory. Lemuria remains visible in those traces, even as it no longer guides investigation. In this state, the name occupies a narrow but stable position. It marks a moment when certain questions lack the tools now used to answer them. Its retreat does not erase its role in shaping early inquiry. It situates that role within a broader pattern of revision and replacement. Survival beyond science. After Lemuria withdrew from active scientific use, it did not disappear from public awareness. Instead, it settled into spaces where empirical validation was not required. Popular literature, spiritual movements, and informal historical writing provided environments in which the term could continue without contradiction. In these settings, Lemuria functioned less as a claim about geology and more as a reference point for deep antiquity. Popular books played a central role in this survival. During the mid-20th century, publishers released volumes on lost worlds, ancient mysteries, and forgotten civilizations aimed at general readers. These books often blended archaeology, myth, and speculative history without clear boundaries. Lemuria appeared in chapters that surveyed vanished lands alongside Atlantis and Mu. The tone was usually calm and explanatory, presenting each subject as part of a broad survey rather than as a contested idea. Magazine articles reinforced this presence. Periodicals devoted to history, exploration, and esoteric topics frequently included short pieces on ancient continents. These articles summarized earlier material rather than introducing new evidence. Lemuria was described in familiar terms, often tracing its origin to 19th century science before moving quickly into broader cultural interpretations. The repetition created familiarity. Readers encountered the name often enough that it felt established. Spiritual movements provided another channel of continuity. Theosophical organizations continued to publish texts and host lectures that referenced Lemuria well into the 20th century. In these contexts, the term was not subject to revision. It belonged to a structured worldview that emphasized cycles of existence and inherited knowledge. Lemuria retained a fixed position within these systems, independent of developments in geology or archaeology. Outside formal organizations, independent writers expanded on these themes. Some drew connections between Lemuria and regional traditions in the Pacific, South Asia, and parts of the Americas. These connections were framed as cultural memory rather than historical record. Oral traditions, myths, and symbols were treated as fragments of a shared past. Lemuria provided a name that unified these fragments without requiring direct proof. Educational boundaries helped maintain this separation. University curricula rarely addressed Lemuria beyond brief historical mention. As a result, many readers encountered the term only through non-academic sources. Without exposure to the context of its scientific retreat, they met Lemuria as an open idea rather than a closed one. The absence of contradiction allowed acceptance to persist by default. Media formats also shaped survival. Radio programs, public lectures, and later television documentaries occasionally referenced Lemuria as part of broader discussions of ancient history. These mentions were usually brief and non-technical. Visuals emphasized oceans, islands, and deep time rather than data. The format favored narrative continuity over methodological detail. Language softened the distinction between hypothesis and tradition. Phrases such as "believed to have existed" or "according to ancient accounts" appeared frequently. These constructions avoided direct assertion while still allowing the idea to stand. Lemuria was presented as something remembered rather than proven, a subtle shift that aligned it with cultural heritage instead of scientific debate. The survival of Lemuria was also aided by its lack of specificity. Unlike sites tied to precise coordinates, Lemuria occupied a broad region and an undefined time. This vagueness made it adaptable. Different authors placed it in different contexts, without obvious conflict. Because there was no single canonical description, contradictions did not accumulate in a way that demanded resolution. Bookstores and libraries reflected this categorization. Lemuria-related works were shelved under alternative history, spirituality, or mythology rather than natural science. This physical separation reinforced conceptual boundaries. Readers browsing these sections expected speculation and symbolism. Lemuria fit comfortably within those expectations. Cultural memory played a role as well. Once a term enters common vocabulary, it can persist independently of its original meaning. Lemuria became shorthand for an ancient, lost beginning. Its sound and structure suggested depth and distance. Even readers unfamiliar with its history could infer its role from context. This intuitive recognition supported ongoing use. The rise of global communication further extended its reach. Translations of older works circulated widely. New writers drew on these sources, sometimes without tracing their origins. In this way, Lemuria traveled across languages and regions detached from its initial scientific framing. Each repetition strengthened the impression of longevity. Digital media later amplified this effect. Early internet forums and websites dedicated to ancient mysteries revived discussions of Lemuria, often combining 19th century sources with modern imagery. These platforms favored accumulation over evaluation. Links led to summaries, which led to further summaries. The structure resembled earlier print cycles, but at greater speed. Scientific silence continued during this period. Researchers did not engage directly with popular treatments of Lemuria because they lay outside disciplinary concerns. This absence of response was interpreted in different ways by different audiences. Within science, it signaled irrelevance. Outside it, silence could be read as uncertainty or avoidance. The survival beyond science did not require consensus. Some writers treated Lemuria as symbolic. Others described it as historical. Many avoided defining it precisely. What mattered was continuity of reference. The name remained available as a way to gesture toward a remote origin without resolving details. In some cases, Lemuria was used as a framework for identity. Individuals and groups interested in ancient heritage adopted it as part of personal or collective narratives. These uses were subjective and varied widely. They further distanced the term from empirical evaluation while strengthening its cultural presence. The endurance of Lemuria outside science illustrates how ideas can persist through function rather than validation. It continued to serve explanatory, symbolic, or narrative roles for different audiences. As long as it fulfilled those roles, there was no internal pressure for it to change. This survival also reshaped expectations. Lemuria was no longer anticipated as a future discovery. It was treated as something already complete, residing in memory rather than awaiting excavation. This removed tension between belief and evidence. The idea did not need confirmation because it was not positioned as a testable claim. By the late 20th century, Lemuria occupied a stable position in popular and spiritual discourse. It was rarely challenged because it was rarely specified. Its meaning was broad enough to accommodate reinterpretation. This flexibility ensured persistence. The distance between scientific retreat and cultural survival remained wide. Each operated under different standards and purposes. Lemuria bridged that distance by shifting form. It left the realm of investigation and entered the realm of narrative. In this form, it could continue indefinitely. Its survival did not depend on future findings. It depended on repetition, recognition, and the enduring appeal of origins placed beyond recorded time. The modern return of old fragments. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the name Lemuria appeared again in public discussion, though in a narrower and more technical context. This return did not involve a revival of the original idea of a sunken continent. Instead, the name was attached to specific geological findings that were fragmentary, localized, and carefully defined. The contrast between the old usage and the new one was marked. Advances in geophysics and geochemistry reshaped how scientists studied the ocean floor. Satellite measurements, seismic surveys, and improved sampling techniques made it possible to analyze regions that had once been inaccessible. These methods revealed complex structures beneath oceans, including ridges, plateaus, and fragments of continental crust embedded within predominantly oceanic settings. The findings were precise, tied to coordinates, depths, and chemical signatures. One area that drew attention was the Western Indian Ocean. Studies of islands such as Mauritius focused on their volcanic origins and underlying structures. In 2013, researchers reported the presence of zircons in beach sands on Mauritius that were far older than the volcanic island itself. Zircons can survive multiple geological processes and retain information about their formation. The ages measured in this case reached into the billions of years, indicating continental material rather than newly formed oceanic crust. The scientific interpretation was cautious. The researchers proposed that fragments of continental crust, likely remnants from the breakup of Gondwana, were present beneath younger volcanic layers. These fragments were described as microcontinents or continental slivers rather than as parts of a single lost landmass. The work fit within established models of plate tectonics and continental rifting. Public response followed a different path. Media reports highlighted the contrast between ancient zircons and young islands. Headlines referenced lost continents and vanished worlds. In some cases, the name Lemuria appeared as a convenient shorthand. The term provided continuity with older narratives, even though the scientific papers themselves avoided it or used it only in historical context. This pattern repeated in other locations. Geological studies identified submerged plateaus and continental fragments in various oceans, including the Indian and Atlantic. Names such as Zealandia gained acceptance because they referred to well-defined, largely submerged continental regions with clear geological boundaries. These cases demonstrated that continents could exist mostly underwater without being mythical. They also showed the importance of precise definition. Lemuria differed from these examples. It lacked agreed-upon boundaries, extent, or structure. Modern geology did not require it as a category. When the name was used, it functioned more as a cultural reference than as a scientific one. The fragments being studied did not align into a single unit that matched 19th century descriptions. Researchers addressed this distinction explicitly. Academic articles emphasize that continental fragments are common byproducts of plate movement. They form through rifting, collision, and separation. Their existence does not imply a coherent, inhabited continent spanning an ocean. This clarification was repeated across publications, reflecting awareness of how easily older terms could be misapplied. The public conversation, however, often blended levels of explanation. Technical findings were summarized in simplified language. Context was shortened. The name Lemuria resurfaced because it was recognizable and evocative. It offered an immediate sense of antiquity without requiring explanation of tectonic processes. Educational media reflected this tension. Documentaries and popular science books sometimes mentioned Lemuria when discussing ancient geology, then clarified that the modern evidence pointed to fragments rather than a whole. The clarification was usually brief. The name lingered longer than the explanation. Visual imagery of submerged lands reinforced older associations. Online platforms accelerated this effect. Articles were shared without accompanying nuance. Excerpts circulated independently of their original framing. Discussions combined peer-reviewed research with speculative interpretation. In these spaces, Lemuria functioned as a label that gathered diverse material under a familiar heading. Scientists remained largely consistent in their approach. They treated Lemuria as a historical term and avoided using it in formal classification. When addressing public questions, they emphasized terminology such as continental crust, microcontinent, and tectonic fragment. These terms carried specific meanings and were supported by data. The older name was not necessary for analysis. The gap between scientific and popular usage became more visible. Modern findings showed that parts of continents can be submerged and preserved. They did not support the idea of a single, extensive, inhabited landmass lost beneath the Indian Ocean. Lemuria's return was therefore partial and symbolic. It attached itself to fragments rather than to a reconstructed whole. This return also altered expectations. Earlier narratives treated Lemuria as something that might one day be rediscovered in full. Modern geology framed discovery as incremental. Each fragment was studied independently. There was no anticipation of a unifying revelation. The process was additive rather than dramatic. Museums and academic outreach reflected this approach. Exhibits on plate tectonics and ocean geology highlighted mechanisms and evidence. Historical references to Lemuria appeared occasionally, usually in sections discussing outdated hypotheses. The emphasis remained on how understanding evolves rather than on validating older ideas. The name's persistence in media did not change its status within science. Lemuria remained outside active research categories. Its use signaled history or metaphor rather than classification. This distinction was maintained consistently in peer-reviewed contexts. At the same time, the modern return of fragments gave Lemuria a new kind of relevance. Writers and educators used it to show how early scientists attempted to explain patterns that are now understood differently. The contrast highlighted progress in method and evidence. The fragments themselves were not insignificant. They provided insights into continental breakup, mantle dynamics, and the long-term history of Earth's crust. These insights addressed questions that once motivated proposals like Lemuria. The difference lay in scale and definition. Modern answers were narrower and more constrained. In public discourse, the coexistence of old names and new data created layered meanings. Lemuria could refer simultaneously to a discarded hypothesis, a cultural symbol, and a loose label for ancient continental material. These meanings did not align, but they did not fully displace one another either. This layered usage reflected the broader theme of the series. Lemuria did not re-enter science as it had left it. It returned indirectly, through fragments that invited comparison rather than confirmation. The name survived by adapting to new contexts without regaining its original function. The modern return of old fragments thus reshaped Lemuria's position once more. It was no longer a proposal awaiting proof, nor merely a symbolic origin. It became a reference point at the intersection of history, geology, and public imagination, attached loosely to findings that were precise but limited. Lemuria as a framework, not a place. By the early 21st century, Lemuria no longer required a map. Its meaning had shifted away from geography so completely that location became secondary. What remained was a structure for organizing ideas about origin, sequence, and deep antiquity. In this form, Lemuria functioned as a framework rather than a place, shaping interpretation without demanding physical boundaries. This change was gradual and largely implicit. Writers who continued to use the term did not announce a redefinition. They simply stopped describing coastlines, distances, or elevations. Lemuria appeared instead as an early stage, a background condition, or a first interval. The absence of spatial detail was not corrected. It was accepted. Frameworks operate differently from locations. A location invites verification. It can be approached, measured, and compared. A framework organizes material by relation rather than position. Lemuria, in this later usage, organized narratives of beginnings. It sat at the start of sequences that extended forward into known history. Its role was to hold that starting position consistently. This framework was visible in how Lemuria appeared alongside other concepts. It was often placed before Atlantis, before early agricultural societies, and before recorded chronology. These placements were relative rather than absolute. Lemuria did not need a date or a coordinate. It needed only to be earlier. Its meaning depended on order, not precision. In popular histories and speculative works, this ordering became standardized. Lemuria occupied the first tier. What followed varied by author, but the initial position remained stable. This stability gave the impression of agreement, even when underlying details differed. Readers encountered the same sequence repeatedly, which reinforced familiarity. The framework also shaped interpretation of evidence. Symbols, myths, or geological fragments were sometimes described as Lemurian, not because they originated from a specific place, but because they were considered very old. The term functioned as a temporal qualifier. It indicated depth rather than source. This usage reduced the burden of proof. If Lemuria was not a place, it did not need borders. If it was not a culture with defined technology, it did not need artifacts. The framework absorbed uncertainty. Missing details did not weaken it, they simply remained undefined. Educational materials outside formal science reflected this approach. Lemuria was introduced as a conceptual layer in long timelines of human or pre-human development. The presentation focused on succession. One age followed another. Lemuria marked the beginning of that progression. The specifics of its existence were left open. The language used to describe Lemuria adapted accordingly. Verbs shifted from physical to abstract. Lemuria was no longer located or submerged. It was placed, assigned, or associated. The change was subtle but consistent. This framework also allowed Lemuria to coexist with modern science without direct conflict. Plate tectonics, evolutionary biology, and archaeology could proceed independently. Lemuria did not compete with these fields because it did not make claims they needed to address. It existed alongside them, operating on a different level. In some cases, Lemuria served as a comparative baseline. Later civilizations were described as more complex, more material, or more documented. It was earlier, quieter, and less defined. This contrast helped structure narratives of development without requiring validation of the starting point. The framework was flexible enough to absorb new material. When geological studies identified ancient continental fragments, these could be referenced as reminders of deep time without redefining Lemuria itself. The framework did not change. It simply accommodated additional examples that emphasized antiquity. This flexibility contributed to endurance. Fixed claims are vulnerable to correction. Frameworks are harder to displace because they do not depend on specific facts. Lemuria's survival in this form reflected an adjustment to that reality. It remained useful precisely because it was no longer precise. Cultural memory reinforced this function. Over time, Lemuria became associated with the idea of a first ordering rather than a first civilization in the conventional sense. It was remembered as a beginning that preceded familiar categories. This memory did not require agreement on content, it required only recognition of position. Writers sometimes acknowledged this shift directly. Lemuria was described as a conceptual continent or an idea space. These phrases did not appear in scientific writing, but they clarified intent for general audiences. Lemuria was not being proposed as something to be found. It was being used as a way to think about time. The absence of contradiction supported this use. Because Lemuria no longer asserted physical claims, it did not encounter direct refutation. Scientific silence continued, but now it aligned more clearly with irrelevance rather than uncertainty. The framework did not intrude on empirical work. This separation affected tone. Discussions of Lemuria remained calm and descriptive. There was no urgency to resolve questions because there were no testable questions left. The framework was complete as it stood. Its purpose was organizational, not investigative. Libraries and digital archives reflected this categorization. Lemuria-related works clustered under headings such as ancient origins, mythic history, or conceptual archaeology. These labels signaled interpretation rather than discovery. Readers entered these sections with different expectations than they would bring to geology or history. the framework also influenced creative work. Fiction, art, and speculative essays used Lemuria as an opening layer. Stories began after it. Worlds were built on top of it. The term functioned as a foundation without needing to be described. Its presence was implied rather than detailed. This usage reinforced the idea that Lemuria belonged to structure rather than substance. It shaped narratives by where it was placed, not by what it contained. In academic discussions of methodology, Lemuria occasionally appeared as an example of how frameworks evolve. Early scientists had used it to organize data they could not yet explain. Later thinkers used it to organize ideas about deep time. In both cases, the framework responded to available tools and needs. The shift from place to framework also clarified why Lemuria did not return to science in its original form. Modern science did not require such a structure. It had more specific models. Lemuria remained useful only in contexts where broad ordering mattered more than mechanism. By this stage, Lemuria's identity was stable. It no longer drifted between definitions. It occupied a conceptual role that did not demand revision. The framework could be referenced, expanded, or ignored without consequence. This stability marked a final transformation. Lemuria began as a provisional geographic explanation. It passed through cultural reinterpretation and scientific retreat. It emerged as a framework for thinking about beginnings that lay beyond documentation. In this form, Lemuria did not seek confirmation. It organized absence rather than evidence. It provided a starting position in narratives that required one, without competing with records that began later: memory, distance, and permanence. By the time Lemuria settled into its role as a framework, its persistence no longer depended on debate. It depended on memory. The name continued to circulate because it had become familiar, and familiarity itself provided stability. Lemuria remained present not because it was defended, but because it was remembered. Memory operates differently from evidence. Evidence requires renewal through discovery and verification. Memory persists through repetition. Lemuria benefited from this distinction. Each time it appeared in a book, lecture, or article, it reinforced recognition rather than argument. Readers encountered it as something already known, even if they could not recall where they first learned the term. Distance played a central role in this process. Lemuria was always placed far from the present, both in time and in location. This distance reduced friction. Claims about recent periods invite correction. Claims about remote ages do not. The deeper the placement, the fewer points of comparison exist. Lemuria occupied a depth where contradiction was difficult to establish. Temporal distance also softened expectations. No one anticipated direct records from such an early stage. Absence of detail felt appropriate, rather than troubling. The idea aligned with general assumptions about deep time, where most events leave no trace accessible to modern study. Lemuria's lack of specificity fit this assumption naturally. Repetition reinforced this alignment. Over decades, the same basic description appeared across different sources. Lemuria was ancient. It preceded known civilizations. It was associated with loss. These elements remained consistent even as interpretations varied. The repetition of structure mattered more than precision of content. Language contributed to permanence. The word Lemuria carried a sound that suggested antiquity. It resembled the names of regions, epochs, and taxa. This linguistic quality allowed it to blend into academic and non-academic writing alike. It sounded established, even when its meaning shifted. Cultural transmission favored such terms. Once a name enters shared vocabulary, it can persist independently of its origin. Lemuria joined a group of words that signaled deep beginnings without demanding explanation. In conversational writing, its mention required little justification. Its function was to indicate remoteness. Distance also protected Lemuria from revision. Scientific theories are revised when new data conflict with them. Lemuria, no longer positioned as a testable theory, did not encounter such conflicts. It existed outside the cycle of hypothesis and correction. This exemption allowed it to remain unchanged. Memory does not operate uniformly. Some details fade while others remain. In the case of Lemuria, the original scientific context faded first. Few remembered Sclater's paper or its specific concern with lemma distribution. What remained was the broader impression of an ancient origin. Memory simplified the idea by shedding its technical roots. Educational exposure reinforced this simplification. Lemuria appeared occasionally in survey courses or popular materials as a historical example. It was mentioned briefly, without elaboration. Students retained the name, not the nuance. This pattern repeated across generations, further detaching the term from its initial framework. Media repetition amplified this effect. Short references in documentaries, articles, and later digital media repeated the same core elements. Lemuria was ancient. It was lost. It came before. Distance in geography contributed as well. The Indian and Pacific Oceans are vast and difficult to visualize fully. Their scale supports abstraction. When Lemuria was associated with these regions, it inherited their sense of immensity. The ocean itself became part of the explanation. What lies beneath it feels naturally hidden. This combination of memory and distance created a form of permanence that did not rely on confirmation. Lemuria endured as long as it remained useful as a reference point. Its role was not to describe a specific event, but to mark a boundary between known and unknown history. The permanence was subtle. Lemuria did not dominate discourse. It appeared intermittently, quietly. This low profile reduced resistance. Controversial ideas attract scrutiny. Familiar background ideas do not. Lemuria occupied the background. In scholarly writing about the history of ideas, this persistence became noticeable. Lemuria appeared repeatedly as an example of how concepts survive beyond their original purpose. Authors noted its endurance without treating it as a problem. It illustrated how intellectual artifacts can outlast the conditions that produced them. Distance also shaped emotional response. Lemuria did not provoke urgency or fear. It was not associated with catastrophe in a specific, datable sense. Its loss was abstract and complete. This emotional neutrality made it compatible with calm, descriptive treatment. The absence of stakes further supported permanence. Lemuria did not alter modern identity, policy, or belief systems directly. It did not require acceptance or rejection. One could acknowledge it as an idea without committing to it. This neutrality encouraged tolerance. In cultural memory, permanence often arises from usefulness rather than truth. Lemuria was useful as a marker of beginnings. It provided a way to talk about what came before without naming specifics. That utility did not diminish over time. As long as people asked where things began, Lemuria could serve as an answer that required no further detail. The structure of memory also favors such placeholders. Early points in a sequence are often less defined than later ones. Histories become clearer as they approach the present. Lemuria fit this pattern. It occupied the least defined position, which protected it from comparison. This permanence was reinforced by contrast. Later chapters of human history are crowded with names, dates, and sites. Lemuria stood apart through simplicity. It represented a single, undifferentiated origin. This simplicity made it easy to remember. Over time, the name itself became the main carrier of meaning. Even stripped of context, it conveyed depth. This quality allowed Lemuria to persist across languages and cultures with minimal translation. Its meaning traveled intact because it was broad. The endurance of Lemuria through memory and distance illustrates a broader principle. Ideas do not always survive because they are accurate. They survive because they occupy stable positions in how people organize understanding. Lemuria occupied such a position. It remained recognizable without needing defense. It remained present without needing proof. Memory maintained it. Distance preserved it, the beginning without a record. Lemuria's final position is defined less by what it contains than by where it stands. It marks a beginning that cannot be documented. Beyond it, records do not extend. Inquiry continues, but documentation does not follow. In this role, Lemuria functions as a boundary rather than a subject, outlining the edge of what can be traced through material means. Most historical study depends on continuity. Evidence accumulates through layers, objects, and texts that connect one period to the next. When such continuity breaks, explanation changes. Lemuria occupies a space beyond that break. It is positioned before writing, before durable architecture, and before stable settlement patterns that leave persistent traces. Its placement explains why records stop without implying that activity stopped as well. This boundary role became clearer as archaeological timelines expanded. Excavations pushed known history further back with each generation. Sites dated to tens of thousands of years were documented with increasing precision. Even so, these extensions remained finite. Beyond a certain point, evidence thinned sharply. Lemuria was placed on the far side of that thinning, where absence became the norm rather than the exception. In this context, Lemuria does not compete with early archaeological cultures. It precedes them. Its presence does not contradict known timelines because it does not intersect with them directly. It begins where stratified sequences dissolve into general prehistory. This separation allows it to coexist with expanding knowledge without being absorbed by it. The lack of record is central to this function. Lemuria is not described as forgotten because forgetting implies loss of something once held. Instead, it is described as unrecorded. This distinction matters. It suggests that the absence of evidence is structural rather than accidental. The boundary is not the result of destruction alone, but of conditions under which recording did not occur. Human societies without writing still leave traces, but those traces diminish rapidly with time. Organic materials decay, landscapes change. In deep time, even stone erodes. Lemuria is placed at a depth where such processes are assumed to have erased nearly everything. The absence of record is therefore consistent with its placement. This consistency allows Lemuria to serve as a conceptual starting point. It provides an answer to the question of origins without specifying mechanisms. It acknowledges that something preceded known history while accepting that it cannot be reconstructed in detail. The boundary is acknowledged, not crossed. In academic discussions of methodology, such boundaries are common. Prehistory itself is defined by the absence of written records. Earlier divisions are defined by the absence of reliable material culture. Lemuria extends this logic further. It marks a zone before even those categories apply. It is pre-prehistory, a domain inferred only through indirect means. This positioning affects how Lemuria is discussed. There is no expectation of narrative detail. Descriptions remain general, the tone stays neutral. Specific claims would invite verification, which the boundary does not support. General placement avoids that pressure. The beginning without a record also reframes loss. Lemuria is not described primarily as a civilization that disappeared. It is described as a phase that passed without documentation. This framing reduces emphasis on catastrophe. The transition is quiet. The boundary closes without drama. Cultural narratives often treat beginnings differently from endings. Endings invite explanation and consequence. Beginnings invite orientation. It establishes where the known sequence starts, even if it does not explain how it began. This orientation is sufficient for many purposes. The absence of record also affects authority. No single text or artifact defines Lemuria. There is no canonical source. This lack prevents consolidation into doctrine. Lemuria remains flexible because nothing anchors it absolutely. Each reference restates the boundary rather than filling it. This flexibility has allowed Lemuria to persist across different interpretive systems. Scientific history treats it as a discarded hypothesis. Cultural history treats it as an inherited idea. Spiritual traditions treat it as a remembered age. None of these claims displace the others, because the boundary accommodates multiple readings. The beginning without a record also explains why Lemuria does not provoke resolution. Questions about it do not accumulate toward a solution. They dissipate at the boundary. Inquiry reaches the edge and stops. This stopping point is accepted rather than challenged. In this way, Lemuria resembles other conceptual boundaries in knowledge. Terms such as deep time or prebiotic earth serve similar functions. They indicate regions where explanation becomes more abstract. Lemuria belongs to this category, even if its origins differ. The boundary role also clarifies why Lemuria appears at the start of sequences so consistently. It occupies the position that requires no justification beyond placement. Once assigned to the beginning, it fulfills its function. Moving it elsewhere would require evidence. Keeping it at the boundary does not. This placement has remained stable despite changes in surrounding knowledge. Archaeology, geology, and anthropology have all revised their timelines. Lemuria's position remains unchanged because it is defined relative to those timelines rather than within them. As long as there is a beginning point to recorded history, Lemuria can remain before it. The absence of record also shapes reader expectations. Lemuria is not expected to become clearer with further study. It is not awaiting discovery. This expectation distinguishes it from unresolved scientific problems. It belongs to a different category of unknown. This distinction reduces tension. Scientific unknowns generate effort. Conceptual boundaries generate acceptance. Lemuria has become the latter. It does not demand resources or resolution. It simply marks where resolution is not available. In educational narratives, this role is sometimes made explicit. Lemuria is introduced as an example of how far interpretation can extend before evidence runs out. It demonstrates the limits of reconstruction. Students encounter it not as a claim to be tested, but as a marker of uncertainty. The beginning without a record also has narrative value. Stories often require a starting point that does not itself require explanation. Lemuria provides such a point. It allows narratives to begin without needing to explain the beginning. This utility supports its continued use in writing and discourse. In this form, Lemuria is complete. It does not evolve further, because evolution would require additional definition. Its purpose is to remain undefined beyond placement. This completeness is paradoxical but stable. The idea began as a scientific proposal, tied to specific observations. It passed through reinterpretation, retreat, and adaptation. It arrived at a position where it no longer functions as an explanation, but as a limit. At that limit, it no longer needs support. Lemuria now stands as a beginning without a record. It marks the point where curiosity remains active, but evidence does not. Inquiry can gesture toward it, but cannot pass through it. In this role, Lemuria does not assert what happened. It defines where knowing stops. If you found this video interesting, take a moment to like it, as it helps more people find this content. You can also subscribe to the channel if you want more calm, long-form documentaries like this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to share this video with anyone who enjoys quiet history and forgotten ideas.